I think of myself as a gender immigrant. And, I lived across the border and I always wanted to be on the other side of the border. And it wasn't healthy or safe for me on the other side in many ways. When I immigrated, everything changed and actually got a lot better. But when I tell people my history, they always change and I always get treated as an immigrant. That was hard at first because, I wanted to belong, but I also got older and got wiser and more generous and more compassionate and recognized there's nothing wrong with being an immigrant. I'm actually kind of proud of it.
Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. In today's episode, we speak with Gayle Roberts, a seasoned fundraiser whose journey began at the age of 6 with a backyard carnival. Now, as Chief Development Officer at Larkin Street Youth Services, she's raised over $200 million to combat youth homelessness and in support of other good causes in San Francisco. A respected figure, Gayle is not only a leader in nonprofit fundraising, but also a proud transgender professional. Her story is as unique as it is inspiring.
This interview is about, me as a fundraiser and my life as a trans person and how those things intersect. So when I got my first fundraising job 24 years ago, the San Francisco Chronicle wanted to profile me with a cover story. And I very reluctantly agreed to that because I wanted to support the cause that I was working for. And I thought the interview went well. We spent 55 minutes talking about the programs, and it was a site visit meeting with our clients, and 5 minutes talking about me and my history. But I saw a draft of the article before it came out in the Sunday paper on the cover, and it was horrible. And I won't go into the details, but they use what in my community, what they call your dead name, which I would just simply call my birth name. And there was other framing devices in it that it was not a complimentary profile in the ways that I would have hoped. And so I called the writer and I said, you either pull this or you rewrite it. They rewrote it. And I swore I would never do another interview about being trans for the rest of my life.
Wow.
And that changed a couple of years ago, but you're the first person to ask me since then.
Well, I appreciate your being willing to talk and to talk about something where clearly that must have been traumatic. So I can see why you didn't want to.
I was young and I did scream and cry a little bit when I first heard about it. And I have more sympathy and understanding for the paper and the author back then. But we all have to set our boundaries in our life. And but this work, I think, also teaches us about compassion, about giving people second chances. And this is not on TV, so I give less fucks. I'm 61.
I do want to maybe circle back to that later, because part of that, embedded in that, is the way people talked about things and the way they didn't understand the boundaries of the people they were speaking to clearly, or else they would have had to make that call.
That's a lot of the work that we do, right? Often fundraisers come from certain communities and then represent other communities. And this is a big challenge in our work.
Right. And probably not always by choice. I mean, this idea about representing communities is funny because as with that article, it sounds like they were asking you about you and the organization, but then they didn't necessarily have a way of talking about that was honoring you. Or
I think there was just a lack of language and understanding. Yeah, I will. At the time, I might not have been as forgiving, but I am now.
So forgiveness is a part of your character anyway, but we were talking even before the interview started about where you're from. And there's a lot of forgiveness in the Midwest. I don't know if you always had it in the Midwest, but I certainly have felt that from time to time. You're originally from Minnesota, is that right?
I am, yes.
Whereabouts?
I grew up in and around the Twin Cities. I've lived in most of the suburbs, western suburbs, eastern suburbs, downtown, all the places.
It's a beautiful part of the country. You were talking about the weather, but the weather is it definitely challenges a person. There's a lot of obviously cold and wind and snow and all of that, and a lot different from where you're living today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in San Francisco. It's a lot easier here.
But Minnesota it has its own thing going on, and you originally come from, I guess, that world of the arts, and that's very strong there as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm actually working on planning a reunion trip to go back home. I haven't been in over a decade. All my family followed me out here. My mom's here, my sister's here. So I don't have immediate family as close back there in the day. But I do miss it. I love the Midwest. I'm a Midwesterner through and through. If you really know me, that's one of the ways to understand who I am. And yeah, when I graduated from college, I went to the University of Minnesota. I'm a gopher. I started as an intern in an arts organization, and then that kind of for the next 15 years, I worked in the arts. I ran my own venue. I had a production company. I ran a national trade association, published a newspaper, worked in all the different kinds of arts, multimedia, video, spoken word, lots of various places, and ended up on the Arts Council for the Minnesota Regional Arts Council at one point. And I really enjoyed that. Yeah, it's something I don't get to do as much now that I've moved here. I have different work, and the economy is just the economics of living in the Bay are different than in the Midwest back then. But I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Were you working then as a practicing artist as well as a producer? Because you had all these production roles, distribution, founder, owner, but were you also creating?
Very little. In fact, but when after I transitioned, I gave myself permission to do the things that I'd never given myself permission. I had maybe you can relate, a family that said you need to do something practical. And so, I worked, but like making art that just was like too far outside of that box. And so, I did a few things back then, but mostly I was the person behind the scenes. And I realized later I was using other people's voices to represent myself and to find myself. So after I transitioned, I went to art school for a year and a half and throwing pots and doing performance pieces. And I turned my home into an open studio and did the open galleries once a quarter, and really enjoyed that. Yeah.
But talk more about kind of letting other people serve as the voice. That was such an interesting observation. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I've always known who I was, but I didn't have language for it. Or I didn't have role models. And I was definitely terrified of coming out, losing my family and other people in my life. My father was a deeply homophobic man, violently so. And when he passed, when I was in my early 30s, I made changes in my life, but I never felt I could before that. That's just me and my own psychology. And as I was exploring the arts, I had I called it a cacophony chorus. It was a spoken word troupe of a dozen rotating different people from diverse backgrounds and identities. And I would host different showcases on Mall of America, First Avenue, the home of Prince, these iconic Midwestern places probably nobody knows about, but other than, if you grew up there, you know of them. And with the local bowling alley, they had a theater that hosted us once a month. And so did in Barnes and Nobles, places like that. So I would curate and I would bring together people around different themes and different identity groups to do performance work. My first 5 years was working in video, and I would curate a video collection from, we had a strong collection from the Native American community because it's strong in the area, also kind of social justice work, some youth and arts programming. And then I ended up becoming a coordinator of an independent distribution network. This was back in the day when we were still using videotape. And so I've always, at least a large part of what I've enjoyed doing is trying to craft culture and find my place in the world.
So this cacophony chorus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fun.
So spoken word.
Not a big money maker. Not a fundraiser, Jay.
Yes, finding money for that might have been hard, but that says a lot too, because talking about finding a voice, it's always hard in the world of writing and spoken word to not always find an audience for it, but maybe also to find the words to describe what you're trying to communicate. So talk a little bit about that. That must have been.
Well, okay, if we can go down that path. So, I had at one point in my life, I had the performance troupe, and to try to figure out how to pay money for it, I created a newspaper, and it was a monthly arts newspaper, and I would write it and lay it out on my little Macintosh, cut and paste, right? This is back in the day, go to Kinko's, and then I would drive it down to where the Star Tribune used to get printed, and we'd print 15,000 copies, and I'd pick them up the next day in a little Jeep, and I'd drive around town to 200 locations and drop them off. But I sold advertising. And so that was my revenue, strategy. And, I freelanced, and I did, productions for other companies and things, and I got paid for that. So I've always been very entrepreneurial. There was something about the arts that's always attracted me, about finding your voice, about a place where everybody belongs, or the arts is so broad. Like there's something for everybody in the arts. So, you can find what you like. And the arts community, by and large, is very accepting and affirming. And so, I just gravitated toward that. I think, when I was younger, my high school grad, counselor, college counselor said, you should go into science, the sciences and tech. Mm-hmm. But I've always been a little bit of everything, or both, in many ways.
So you eventually made that trip to San Francisco. How did that happen? How did you decide to move to California?
So I had a partner at the time, and I was looking to make some changes in my life as well, and they were very supportive of that. I took a train ride to Portland, to Seattle, to San Francisco. This was I was actually researching the arts community at the time, doing an article about that. We looked at Houston, other places, but we came out here to San Francisco, and they took one look, literally driving down the road from the airport to our hotel, and was like, this is where we need to move. And they were really the one who was the instigator in that move. I was in my mid-30s, so I've spent half my life in the Midwest and half my life out here in the Bay. And the rest, as they say, is history. And we can talk about that as little as much as you want.
Well, you introduced that concept of kind of acceptance and, people embracing things. And that's certainly true of the world of the arts. That's the world that I knew in the Midwest. Yeah. But that's a microcosm. I think a lot of people maybe look at California generally, and maybe the Bay Area specifically, as a place where you can be yourself. What was that your experience of moving there initially?
Well, I think the Bay Area is much more complicated than a lot of people in our PR. I think that I as part of the LGBTQ plus community, I found a home here. I'm also white, middle upper class. If you're a person of color or lower income, the Bay Area is not that affirming for you. And San Francisco in particular, if you just look at the demographics, they tell the story. So I think it's a complicated story about San Francisco and California in general. I think that, it's much safer for me to live here than in many places in the country, unfortunately. and becoming increasingly so. And it's where I found, a home and work. And I don't know where else I would move, to be honest, but, I always, me and my family now, we have conversations about that.
About whether California is.
Well, I'm 61. My family members are a little younger than me. So, thinking about where do we always end up? Because growing old in San Francisco is it's a hard thing to do. It's expensive here.
Yes, it is. It is expensive out there. It's also a place where, once again, it seems like things have changed over time. So when you first moved there, was the environment one where you could really settle into your roots and your work and develop a community? And today, is it still as easy, especially given the finances of the area? I mean, trying to live there, own a home, and
I think it's got to be harder now. I moved here during the first tech boom in the middle of the 90s. And I remember trying to find an apartment. I slept on the floor of a warehouse for a few weeks and then tried to find an apartment. And, the people would be lined up at the door to see it. And, you'd have to make a bid, when you're there and pay more than what it was offered for. But the prices have just, gone up, and the housing stock, since I work in the housing space, I can talk a little bit about this. We're about 80,000 units short. And, there's the rental prices are at the top of the market in the entire US. And there's not a lot of production coming down the pipeline, even though there's some state regulations and pressure around that. So I think it's gotten harder over the years. There's still opportunity here. People are moving here. I met one of my cousins recently I'd never met before. He just moved here to, become an AI guy. But, it's not an easy place. We have a young person who spoke at one of our events last week. Amazing young man. Grew up in St. Louis, moved here to, make a living. Also slept on somebody's couch for a year. Finally, found Larkin Street. We didn't have dedicated housing for him, so he ended up in our shelter program for several months. Then he went into congregate housing, and then into independent living, which is where he is now. And over that course of time, he completed not one, but 3 college degrees. I mean, so it's remarkable. So it is possible to still, pursue the dream here, but it is not easy.
When you first went out, I guess the arts were still the focus of your professional life. Is that right at that point?
That was my heart, but I had, since you worked in the arts for a while yourself, you get to meet people. And so I had a network in Minnesota, and I came out here and I knew nobody, and I needed a job. So I got a marketing job at a nonprofit that did management support for other nonprofits, and ended up becoming the director there. And then that's kind of my whole course, shifted over a period of time away from the arts. But, I went to a performance piece over the weekend, and and I enjoy being an audience member as well. So it's all good.
Well, and you were always an entrepreneur along the path anyway, either needing to.
I think that, yeah, I got that from my father. That was him.
That was him. Yeah. So you were out there, you were working in marketing, and that was also, I guess, this period where you were changing professionally, and also you, I guess, I don't know how soon it was after that you transitioned, but can you talk a little bit about the professional context for that, what that was like, and whether or not
it's an interesting story. So yeah, I moved here in the mid to late 90s, and I started to explore my identity and found community, and I found a job. And outed myself to my boss, who was part of the LGBT community himself. And I worked there for 3 years, and I slowly did my transition. When I finally, what they call in the community, went full time, I got summarily fired. I had made all my financial goals, and but they didn't want me to be the face of the nonprofit. I can say this now. They literally put me in an office down the hall where nobody could see me, and I had to finish up launching a new website, working with contractors. And I was let go, and the severance pay was never paid. the promise paid, and there was no legal protections back then, and went to the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, and the best they could do was to threaten to publicize it. So I got a compromise, partial severance package, and then I went about trying to find work, and I couldn't find work for a year. That's why I went back to school. Nobody would hire me. I found work part-time, working for tips, no pay, in a friend's restaurant. And along that way, a friend of mine who I used to work with, who was a fundraiser for that nonprofit, invited me to Development Executives Roundtable, one of the two trade associations. And I will be forever grateful to Miss Susan Fox for that. I went and I found my people. I volunteered. I became a member. I took every free class I could. I found a job dialing for dollars part-time for the symphony, 20 hours a week. Horrible job, but gave me some strengths. And then I wrote grants for free for a local arts nonprofit, and then joined a board of an LGBT mental health association. And after 6 months of intentional work, I finally found full-time work working for Lyric, the LGBT community center here in town. But it was fundraisers. It was the development community that welcomed me. And I eventually became the board president of DER. And I just rolled off being on the board of local chapter of AFP. I love fundraisers. They're my people. They saved me.
The way you talked about being summarily fired and the way you were treated in that last little part, it sounds like in some ways you've put that behind you, especially since you found your tribe within the fundraising community.
Yeah.
And you certainly are a leader there today. The reason I go back to that is it may surprise many people who haven't been through a similar journey that a person can be treated like that any person can be treated like that under any circumstances, but especially in a place where you felt like you'd found a home in that city, in that time, in that organization. The legal issues aside, when you look back at that and you think about that, what do you imagine is the change, if any, that we've seen from that time to today? Can that happen today to someone?
Yes,
city?
Unfortunately it can. And in some places it's gotten worse. We could have a conversation about what's going on in Florida or other places in the country right now. I'd rather not get into all those details. I can direct you to websites for that. When I guess there's two things that come to mind. I needed to make a change in my life, and not everybody was okay with that change. I lost some family members. I lost a partner. My partner was supportive, but couldn't follow me. I think of myself as a gender immigrant. I think the immigration metaphor is, I don't know why more people don't use it that are trans, but for me, it's perfect. I lived across the border, and I always wanted to be on the other side of the border, and it wasn't healthy or safe for me on the other side in many ways. And when I immigrated, everything changed and actually got a lot better. But when I tell people my history, they always change, and they always get treated as an immigrant. I never get treated as a native citizen. And that was hard at first because, I wanted to belong. But I also got older and got wiser and more generous and more compassionate, and recognized there's nothing wrong with being an immigrant. I'm actually kind of proud of it. But it's, it took me some time to get to that place. So, my former boss didn't want an immigrant representing his organization. And, I use that term loosely and not trying to diminish somebody who's immigrated from another country, but there's similarities. Things have gotten a lot better on one way. There's lots more institutional support. There's a lot more understanding and kind of languaging. There's a stronger community. When I first came out, I was trying to find people. And we're everywhere. There are 2 million of us in the country, more than many of the states' populations combined. And there's a huge backlash, and it's organized, and it is there is an organized genocide attempted to be, and I don't use that word lightly, against trans folks in this country in the early stages, and it is terrifying.
You were now part of the fundraising community, which was a very different place, it sounds like. And that idea that people are just, they're in it together for the work. There's all different sorts of work and fundraising for all different sorts of causes. You specifically have chosen, especially in recent years, to work not only within the community, within the LGBTQ plus community, but also specifically there at Larkin with the most vulnerable, arguably the most vulnerable population of all, not just in San Francisco, but in the country. And can you talk a little bit about how you chose to work there, how they chose to partner with you?
It's partly a choice and partly the only choice I had. It's LGBTQ people. Every job that I've ever had, a full-time job, it's always been a queer person who's hired me. While I contracted for 5, 6, 7 years off and on and worked for a variety of different organizations, once again, the people who wanted me to be, representing them were family, so to say. And obviously, when we do this work, it's helpful if we can connect to the mission on a spiritual or a personal level. I think that a skilled fundraiser can raise money for anything. But if it's something that they have skin in the game on, I think it's more powerful. The conversations are more authentic. The asks are stronger. People work harder. So, I work for an LGBT. It's not an LGBTQ organization, but it is an LGBTQ affirming organization with about a third of our population coming from there. My CEO is out lesbian. There are other people on the C-suite and the staff who are LGBTQ plus. And so I work in a very affirming work, and part of the population that we serve, I see myself in. But we work with a growing monolingual, non-documented population. We work with a large parenting and pregnant population, a growing kind of trans or gender non-binary population. If you look at the numbers and you just look at it kind of systemically, it's very clear why these young people are experiencing homelessness. They've had some sort of systemic or structural challenge in their life. And it's not really individual. Though each one has an individual story. And so I've always worked on issues that try to address structural change, because I think that's important.
How are you conveying that to prospective donors who, again, many may not have had a direct link to this experience that those you're serving are experiencing? And
I think many people actually have a connection where it's not personal or it might be familiar. I have a board member I won't name, but, they had some children who had some challenges, and somebody else had another family member. And so there's people come to this issue in a variety of ways as donors. We had a reception last week for a woman who she hosted us. She helped us raise $50 million over a couple of years for a federated or collaborative campaign between us and other groups. It's called Rising Up, and very successful. And you'd have to ask her, and I'm not going to name her because I don't want to put words into her mouth specifically, but she's a multi-generational family here in San Francisco, and her family is very prominent, and she recognizes the blessings that she's received, and she gives back. And she worked. She didn't just give money to us. She worked. She came to all the committee meetings, and she asked all of her friends. And, I get the opportunity to work with amazing women like her or some of our young people who, come from very different class backgrounds, but all of them are looking to make a better world. And, I just feel so blessed, in that opportunity. This work is not easy, but this work busts open my heart and makes it bigger all the time.
What is the hardest part and what's the most joyful part?
That's a good question. I think the hardest part is just like, I'm a C-suite officer, right? I manage a team of 12 people. I have a budget goal of $10.2 million. I'm in a downturning economy. I have 27 board members and 64 honorary board members. And last year we got 4,500 gifts, managing that process, managing the different expectations and communicating and working across lines of class and privilege. It's not always easy. I have an amazing board and executive leadership team and boss. And sometimes I make mistakes and I say the wrong thing. And I have to, apologize or help a couple of people work together more effectively. So it's the C-suite stuff that I'm still learning. That's the hard part, I think. And, some of the stress that comes with being responsible for raising money that keeps 1,700 youth off the street, let alone 250 people employed. The joy, at that event last week, we had one of our youth speak, and I already shared, the story, I think. It just blows open my mind. I was the first to stand up and applaud, the first to go over and shake his hand. He did all the work, right? We just created a pathway for him. And that's a lot of what we do at Larkin Street. The secret sauce is we create the pathway. And the work, and the youth walk through it, once they're given the opportunity. And I get to witness that, sometimes up close, sometimes far away. It just brings immense joy to me. Or even working with one of my team members or staff who, helping them, coach them through, a situation. I'm just rolling off the board of the local chapter of AFP because I have to focus on a capital campaign next year. But I ran the mentorship program there, co-led it for the last 3 years. And, just holding space for somebody who's going through some challenges in their professional life. And, I've done it before. I can, hold space and maybe reflect back for them some things. And so, it's amazing the opportunities this work has. And I'm very, very grateful. I don't know why everybody doesn't want to be a fundraiser. I like it seriously, Jay. I meet so many people who are afraid to ask for money. And I'm like, actually, I hardly ever ask for money. I actually just create the context and people usually give. And then, asking for money is not actually that hard.
Yeah, I'm imagining that when, again, many people think of the area where you live, they think of one of these two images, which are very big stereotypes, the economic stereotypes. One is lots of people living in tents on the street. And the other is this amazing stack of cash. And of course, both of those are just that. They're just, terrible reductions of real life there.
Yeah, there's some truth, and it's also reductions, very much so. Yeah.
But it's also this world that you're living in where you are working with people, where you're providing them a pathway, and there's extraordinary need. And then there are people in the general vicinity who do have resources that they haven't yet applied to this purpose. Has that part of this gotten easier or harder?
I've never found that hard. Well, I find it, we used to have events on top of the Salesforce Tower. And so, you go from the Tenderloin where our offices are, which is a impoverished inner city neighborhood, to the top of the Tenderloin where you're kind of, in nirvana, you're literally 50 stories high or whatever, and you do that in 30 minutes. So the perspective changes and the class changes and all the things. But I kind of grew up in that kind of environment too, of moving around in different places. And so I'm used to that. I think it's maybe one of the things I bring to the work. I had one side of my family that was growing up that was very, very privileged, and one side that was not so much. So, that sometimes causes existential tension within myself. But I find within this work, people bring their best selves to it. I'm not, having the conversation with somebody that's, I don't know, arguing over some sort of financial capital division business plan. I don't know, people come to me with an open heart typically, and they're looking for a way to make a difference. And most of them don't know how to do that. If you live in the city and you read the news, you feel a little impotent, even if you're making a lot of money and have a successful life, because there are people who are hurting and there's not a strong solution pathway. But Larkin Street and other nonprofits, we provide that pathway. So, not only just for a pathway for the youth, but a pathway for the donor to feel empowered. That you could be a person, of significant means, but feel impoverished. But when you start to give $10, 10,000, 10 million, whatever it is, you realize you have enough for the first time, maybe in your entire life. I provide that opportunity to people, and they write me the $10,000 check and they say thank you and they give me a hug. Right? Well, there's a spiritual practice to development or fundraising that I think is the thing that I enjoy the most, and that I don't think people who don't do this work don't understand it, and people who might do just say like grant writing or something don't quite understand. But when you start actually talking to individuals and even people of high net worth, or particularly volunteers and others, you have the conversations that we've all been waiting for.
You and I have talked before about the mechanics and even strategy of fundraising, and you're very innovative in this space, using AI and other tools to make operations efficient, effective, et cetera. But there's always the question about what's next. And part of that's just, what is it we want to do to meet the capital campaign goal? But the other part's, what is the vision that we have personally? Mm-hmm. You talked about how the first half of your life was out there in Minnesota. Second half of your life has been there in California. Those demarcations may be somewhat arbitrary, but I know at this point in my life, I also think about the next third. Oh, what are you thinking about as you look forward to the next third? Not only in terms of the work you do, but the life that you have chosen.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that was going to be the question. That's a good question, though. I turned 62 in May. And so, there are these kind of arbitrary numbers that shift how we think about things. I've also had some minor illnesses in the last few years that have just, set me back a little bit when I think about what I'm realizing, like my midlife is at the end of the midlife, or the golden ages or whatever, because people say midlife goes to 70 now or whatever. I don't know, but I do think I've definitely entered the final third of my life. The mentorship I do is something that's really important to me. I've been doing that for quite some time, and some of my closest chosen family members are people who I've mentored over my life. And I want to continue that. On just a practical basis, I own a home in San Francisco with a big mortgage. I got to pay that down. So, I am working till I retire. Like, I'm looking at 67 if I can or more. And then I also have a chosen family, which I don't want to get into too many details, but I have a chosen queer family, and I have people in my life who I really adore. And we are already talking about, what our life might look like together in the future. And that's the thing that actually brings me the biggest joy, is because I have family, and for a long time, I wasn't sure I'd ever have family in my life. My mother moved out here 12 years ago. I adore her. I saw her yesterday. My sister's here. My partner is here. My chosen daughter lives out in New York, but we're close. And I have some other people who are part of my chosen family as well. I hope that I won't have to work all the time so that I can enjoy my family more. That would be my wish.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast. Thanks very much to our sponsor, DonorSearch, the world leader in fundraising intelligence, and of course our producer, Jack Frost. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, the DonorSearch YouTube channel, or wherever you like to listen. And consider giving us a like and a positive review so others can find us too. Check out our live webinars and webcasts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and come back next Friday for our next interview with another leader in the world of social good. Until then, this is Jay Frost. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.